Hi there, music fans. Happy New Year and welcome to episode 49 of Music is a Journey. In order not to give you a really super long video this time, I'm going to break it into 3 parts. Today, in part 1, we are going to take a look at albums that were released in 1972. Now, last year when I did my video of albums that were released in 1971, I talked about every single 1971 release that I have. And I've decided that for this year, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to talk about 7 favorites of mine. Not necessarily the albums that I consider are the best albums. Maybe they are, maybe they're not, in my opinion, but just albums that I really like from 1972. But before that, I'm going to run over a list of albums that were released in 1972 and also mention some artists that released albums in 1972 just to paint a picture of what the musical landscape was like in that year. As for the way I see it, I mean, I was 1 year old at the time, so of course I don't have any direct memories of what was happening. But my impression of the year 1972 is that it was a transitional year for 2 of my favorite genres. First of all, really heavy rock was kind of coming to an end around 1972. It was the beginning of the transition of that kind of heavy downer rock, heavy psychedelic, whatever style, and moving more into the hard rock style. You know, from after 1972, like 73 and onwards, we would start to see bands like Aerosmith and Kiss, and Ted Nugent would eventually graduate from the Amboy Dukes and start off as a solo act and so on. But, you know, from 69 to 1972, thereabouts, that's when the really heavy stuff was popular, and the term heavy metal was coined and was starting to be applied to that heavy stuff, and then it kind of faded out of fashion. A lot of heavy bands split up. Some of them changed their style and became more rock style, or funk rock, whatever. Some of them became progressive, and, you know, some of them just members went off and did different things. Also, we see progressive rock, I think, is really hitting its peak. You know, it started to build up around 1969. You had King Crimson in the Court of the Crimson King. By 1971, you know, Steve Howe joined Yes. Phil Collins and Steve Hackett were in Genesis. And by 1972, 73, I think those are the kind of peak years for some of the most memorable prog rock albums. But of course, 1971 was as well. And then there was just a whole lot of other cool stuff going on in music. Whatever your taste was, jazz fusion, soul, funk, roots rock, whatever, it was all happening. So I'm just going to read over a list of albums from 1972. Some of the most important ones, we see David Bowie, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The Rolling Stones, Exile on Main Street. I've been thinking I should probably get that one. Neil Young released Harvest. Roxy Music released a self-titled album. Alice Cooper, School's Out, which I don't have. Joni Mitchell and Simon Garfunkel releasing albums for, I guess, the folk quarters of the time. Marvin Gaye, Linda Ronstadt, that type, not my brand of music, but they're out there selling albums. Chicago released Chicago 5 with Saturday in the Park. Slade, 2 albums, a studio album called Slade and Slade Alive. And as I understand it, Slade were really having a hard time getting their studio singles and albums sold, but when they did Slade Alive, that's what really kicked off their career. And the same thing happened a few years later with Kiss. They released, I think, 3 albums that were kind of, yeah, okay, we're kind of getting the idea, and then they did Kiss Alive, and boom, off they went. Mott the Hoople, All the Young Dudes. Pete Townsend, Who Came First, his first solo album. The Eagles' self-titled album, Aphrodite's Child, with their big album, 666. Frank Zappa, The Grand Wazoo. Hawkwind releasing an album. Electric Light Orchestra releasing their second album in 1972. Of course, Fleetwood Mac have an album out. Still not the lineup that, you know, was going to catapult them into stardom. But, you know, Fleetwood Mac nevertheless on the scene. And the first Nuggets compilation, Psychedelic Rock Collection from 1965 to 1968. The first release of a series of many to come. In Italy, you had the Italian prog scene totally kicking off here in 1972 finally with Premiata Forneria Marconi, if I say that correctly, Per un amico, and Storia di un minuto. Storia di un minuto. Banco del Mutuo Soccorso, self-titled album, and Darwin with an exclamation mark. And then L'Orme, also releasing an album, and a band whose name is Y''S, and I really don't know how I would read that in Italian. Maybe Is, not sure. In Germany, you had Can, Tangerine Dream, Popol Vuh, Amondol 2, and a bunch of other krautrock bands and beginnings of the German electronic music scene. And a little bit closer to my collection, Moody Blues' Seventh Sojourn, a Moody Blues album I still haven't got yet. Emerson, Lake and Palmer with Trilogy, one album I haven't got yet. Budgie, their second album, Squawk, haven't got yet. Pink Floyd, Obscured by Clouds, a kind of movie soundtrack thing that had some cool stuff. Status Quo, Pile Driver, actually the only Status Quo album I have, and I like it. Jade Warrior, Last Autumn's Dream. Gentle Giant with 2 albums, Three Friends and Octopus. Three Friends having my favorite Gentle Giant song, Peel the Paint. Nectar, A Tab in the Ocean, my favorite Nectar album. Renaissance, the brand new lineup of Renaissance, releasing their first one, Prologue, after the previous 2 albums included ex-Yardbirds alumni. The band completely shifted over to an entirely new lineup and released a new album there. Annie Haslam on vocals. Blue Oyster Cult's debut album, self-titled Wishbone Ash release. Argus, probably their most biggest well-known album. Bang! An American hard heavy rock band doing an album called Mother and Bow to the King. I think side 1 is Mother and side 2 is Bow to the King. Jerusalem, one of the last of the really heavy, hard-hitting rock bands of the early 70s, released their only album, self-titled, produced by Ian Gillan. Dust released their second album, Heart Attack. Their drummer would later on go in to be in the Ramones. Styx debut. Scorpions debut with Lonesome Crow, the only album recorded by that lineup, when after that Michael Schenker went off to join UFO and the Scorpions folded. And then Klaus Meine and Rudolf Schenker ended up joining with Uli John Roth in his band Red Dawn, and then the new Scorpions was born. So that is a kind of rundown of albums that kind of stood out for me after checking lists on the internet. And now I'm going to give you 7 albums that are among my favorites from 1972. First up, oh, you're not going to recognize it unless I show you this one, Deep Purple Machine Head. Yeah, well, if you know me, that had to come up. Deep Purple is one of my favorite bands. Deep Purple's Machine Head, probably, of course, their most well-known album with songs like Smoke on the Water, Space Trucking. Interesting story, they all worked hard together to write the song called Never Before, and they were thinking we're going to release it as a single and it's going to be a big hit. And it kind of just smoldered a little and didn't really do much. But another track that they had not really thought of as a single took off in their live performances and soon became their biggest, most well-known song ever, Smoke on the Water. And of course that tells the story of what happened when they were recording Machine Head, the famous fire at the Frank Zappa show and the hotel burning down, and they're losing their recording venue and having to go to another hotel with no heat in the winter and use the Rolling Stones mobile recording unit. Anyway, Deep Purple's Machine Head. It's an album where I've heard it so many times and then I didn't listen to it for a long time, and in the meantime I listened to a lot of prog and I started writing reviews for Prog Archives and Metal Music Archives, and then I went back and listened to it one day and I just suddenly realized, man, these guys are really brilliant musicians. Like, I can really sense that now. And you know, a little more than a year later, David Coverdale would join Deep Purple, and in an interview he said, now I've played with good musicians before, don't get me wrong, but the musicians in Deep Purple just, it was a whole nother level. So yeah, great stuff, and yeah, I like it. And of course, also 1972, a favorite album, Yes, Close to the Edge, probably one of the most important albums in rock, progressive rock history. In fact, some years ago, I checked the top prog albums on several lists, probably a dozen lists. And as it turned out, the most commonly chosen number 1, or in the top 3, was Yes is Close to the Edge, and as well King Crimson in the Court of the Crimson King, both of them tied for the most highly ranked prog rock albums ever. So there we have, yes, Close to the Edge. Side 1, the title track, I love it. I think that is exemplar of what an epic long side long track should be. An epic side long track should be. And of course, on the other side, you have And You and I and Siberian Kotaru. Just a brilliant album, standout album. And this is the one where drummer Bill Bruford said, there's nowhere else we can go with this as far as he was concerned. He said, that's the album, that's the cookie. And now I'm going to move on. And he went and joined King Crimson. Yes, Close to the Edge. And another big name prog brand of the 70s, Genesis. Foxtrot, the second album with Phil Collins and Steve Hackett. And I love this one. I love the first three with those guys in there. Nursery Crime, Foxtrot, and Selling England by the Pound. This one here has also a really long, 23-minute long song, Supper's Ready. And again, we have Steve Hackett using his finger-tapping guitar playing technique, which, you know, would later on be developed further by Edward Van Halen. But in the middle of Supper's Ready here, you can really hear it beautifully, because at one point it's just the guitar and that finger-tapping style. And I think Steve Hackett said that he hit upon it because he was watching Tony Banks playing the keyboard and thinking, I want to play those notes too, but on a guitar, you can't play them like that unless you play like this. And that was how Steve Hackett hit upon doing the finger tapping technique. I understand he's not the only one to do it, but he is one of the first to do the finger tapping thing. And maybe Alan Holdsworth was the other one. Anyway, Foxtrot. Of course, this also has Watcher of the Skies, a big song. And I like Can Utility and the Coastliners. That's one of my favorite prog rock songs that's under 6 minutes long. It's brilliant. Okay, then another favorite of mine, Black Sabbath Volume 4. Now this is funny because this was the second Black Sabbath album I ever got. Mob Rules was the first, this was the second. And I got it simply because it was $6.99 on cassette, whereas other albums were $7.99, $8.99, $9.99. So, and we're talking about like 1982, around this time. So it sounded really different from Mob Rules, but I really liked it. Of course, changes, you know, the piano ballad with Ozzy singing, and FX, okay, kind of interesting. Laguna Sunrise, very beautiful, but the rest of the album really kicks ass. Great stuff. I especially love Wheels of Confusion, but all the heavy stuff on here is cool. This is the album where Black Sabbath went across to the US to record it, and they got I think they said soap boxes of cocaine shipped in, and Tony Iommi remembers they would all just be lying about during the recording time doing nothing. And he thought, okay, nobody's going to move unless I get up and play something. So he was the first to get up and start playing something. And then everybody else kind of stirred out of their stupor. And of course, one song on here, Snowblind, is even related to their cocaine problems at the time. And they somewhere in the original album too, it said dedicated to the great Coke Company of America or US or something like that. But anyway, what's interesting here is Black Sabbath is starting to evolve a little bit more progressive than previously. They were kind of lumped in with the progressive bands in the beginning anyway, because around that time in England, 69, 70, 71, the whole progressive rock explosion covered anything from jazz fusion right up to heavy rock. And so Black Sabbath kind of were included a little bit, but this is where, by musical standards, they actually do start to venture a little bit more into the prog territory, of course still being a heavy band, and one of the heaviest albums, if not the heaviest, of 1972. I always thought it was kind of odd that I should like this album, and I thought maybe it's just because I'm kind of biased because it was the second album I ever got. I was, like 11 years old or something like that at the time. But I have since heard a lot of people ranking Black Sabbath's albums. They place this one near the top, if not as the top Black Sabbath album. So that's kind of cool to know. Black Sabbath Volume 4, a big favorite of mine. Thick as a Brick by Jethro Tull after, yes, Close to the Edge and King Crimson in the Court of the Crimson King. Thick as a Brick is probably the next in line for legendary progressive rock albums. I will confess that I actually enjoy listening to Aqualung more. I think it's just easier for me to take the different songs as they are. I find this one here is packed with great music and a drum solo, for heaven's sake. But I could have had it as different songs, possibly. I'm not sure if that's blasphemous saying so. But anyway, Thick as a Brick by... And also, I only got this about like a few years ago, whereas Aqualung I've known since, what, like high school? Or younger, junior high school? Yeah, I remember somebody telling me that Jethro Tull was like hard rock with a flute. Which is probably kind of true. Anyway, Jethro Tull, Thick as a Brick, a very important album in the annals of prog history. Uriah Heep, Demons and Wizards. Now, they released 2 albums in 72. The other one was The Magician's Birthday. I really like both albums, and in a way, I like the sound of Magician's Birthday better. Plus, I really love that drum and guitar duel where the good magician and the evil magician are fighting each other in the song. But I think overall, Demons and Wizards just has a more fullness to it. I don't know. The guitar sound is really rich in here. And of course, this is also the album that produced their only kind of hit song, Easy Living. I think they haven't really had any other hits. What is it now? Circle of Hands and then The Spell are 2 songs I really like. And I love The Wizard at the beginning of this album here. That beautiful guitar at the beginning. So yeah, I suppose this one is a notch above Magician's Birthday. So, Uriah Heep, Demons and Wizards from 1972. Apparently, Roger Dean, he did the artwork here, and apparently there is a kind of like vagina-themed rock up here, and somewhere in here there's also a kind of penis-themed thing. So, I mean, this is kind of like subtleties woven into the landscape. Whatever. I read that somewhere, and then, of course, I had to go find it. And the last one I want to mention from 1972, this is Captain Beyond's self-titled album. I've talked about this before. This is just one solid, killer, hard-rocking album that borderlines progressive. You've got, what's his name, Bobby Caldwell on drums, amazing drummer, and just fantastic stuff here. You've got Rod Evans, formerly of Deep Purple, on vocals. You've got Lee Dorman on bass and Larry Reinhardt on guitar. Those 2 formerly of Iron Butterfly. This is just such an awesome album. And I didn't know about it until about 10 years ago. I never heard about it before, but it's brilliant. Pretty much solid, hard-packed, energetic rock. Gets a little acoustic in places, kind of eases off a little bit in places, but basically a really intense, fantastic album. If you haven't heard it yet, and you really love early 70s hard, intense rock with a progressive edge, check out Captain Beyond. Okay, that's my pick for 7 favorite albums of 1972. I do want to mention the Canadian scene a little bit here, because I do that. April Wine released their 2nd album on record with Could Have Been Alright, Could Have Been Here Tonight, Could Have Been Sweet as Wine, Could Have Been a Lady. I used to hear that song on the record, on the radio all the time, and I didn't know it was April Wine until I got into them. Thundermug, an excellent hard rock band out of Ontario, released their debut album, and their big hit on there was Africa, which incidentally has a kazoo solo in, and so does The Magician's Birthday of Uriah Heep. They also have kazoo playing on there. Who'd have thought, huh? 1972, year of the kazoo and the Great Wazoo. Whatever. The Guess Who released an album. They have a live song called Running Back to Saskatoon. Heartbroken Bopper and Blood on the Lifeline were also hit songs for them that year. A Foot in Cold Water, another awesome hard-rocking Canadian band, released their debut in 72. Their ballad, Make Me Do Anything You Want, was their big hit, and later on covered by Helix in 1984. And then other Canadian bands, the Stampeders, Lighthouse, 5-man electrical band, and of course you've got Paul Anka and Anne Murray and all those other famous people. So that is what was happening in 1972 in Canada as well. Anyway, there you go, my 7 picks for 1972, as well as the musical landscape of 1972, at least in the Western Hemisphere. I kind of ignored Japanese bands this time, sorry. So this is part 1. In part 2, I will go on to 1982 and do kind of the same format. And then in part 3, we'll do 1992. So let's see what I find in those ones. For now, thanks for watching, and see you in the next one. Bye, folks.